The folder was already open in my hands when my nephew's father looked across the room and realized what I was about to do. The color left his face so completely that even his own wife reached out to touch his arm. 300 people in that ballroom, and every single one of them turned to watch. I had waited 22 years for this moment. I was not going to waste it. But I should start at the beginning, because the beginning is the part that matters most. My name is Margaret, and I was 53 years old when my younger sister died on a Tuesday morning in October. The call came while I was at my desk grading papers. I was a high school English teacher in Dayton, Ohio, the kind of woman who brought homemade cookies to faculty meetings and kept extra pens in her cardigan pocket. My whole life was quiet and predictable, and exactly the way I had built it. Then the phone rang, and nothing was ever the same again. My sister Carol had been sick for 2 years, but she had refused to tell me how sick. That was Carol, always protecting everyone else from the weight of her own problems, always smiling over the parts that hurt. When I drove to her apartment that afternoon, her son was sitting on the front steps with a backpack between his feet. He was 7 years old. His name was Daniel. He had his mother's eyes and his mother's way of tilting his head when he was trying to be brave about something. He looked up at me and said, "She told me you were coming." I sat down on the step beside him. I did not cry, not yet, because he needed me to be steady. I put my arm around him and I said, "I'm here, baby. I've got you." That was the promise I made. Not out loud, not to anyone who could hold me to it legally. Just to myself, and to my sister's memory, and to that small boy sitting on those cold concrete steps. I've got you. I meant every word of it. Daniel's father was a man named Richard Harlow. I had met him exactly 4 times before Carol died, and I had disliked him every single time, in the way you dislike someone not because of anything they've done to you specifically, but because something in your gut says, this person is not who they say they are. Richard was charming in the particular way that men who have never been told no tend to be charming. Smooth, attentive, full of easy compliments that somehow left you feeling emptier than before he spoke. He and Carol had dated for less than a year before she got pregnant. After Daniel was born, Richard had drifted in and out of their lives on a schedule that suited only himself. When Carol died, Richard showed up at the funeral in an expensive suit and cried in a way that seemed designed to be noticed. He spoke to me exactly once. He said he was going to do right by his boy. Then he disappeared for 11 months. I had already petitioned for guardianship by then. The paperwork took 4 months and most of my savings and legal fees, but I got it. Daniel came to live with me in my small house on Elmwood Drive, and I rearranged my entire life around his. I moved his bedtime earlier so I could grade papers after he slept. I switched to the middle school 2 miles closer so I could be home by 4. I learned to braid hair, badly at first, then well enough that he stopped wincing. I learned the names of every single one of his friends, his teachers, his fears, his favorite sandwiches. I learned what his crying sounded like in the middle of the night when the dreams about his mother came back. And I learned exactly how long to sit beside him before the silence helped more than the talking. I am not telling you this to make myself sound saintly. I made plenty of mistakes. I was too strict in the beginning, too frightened of losing him to give him room to breathe. I missed his first Little League game because of a parent-teacher conference I couldn't reschedule. I cried in the car more times than I can count, not because raising him was a burden, but because I loved him so ferociously and so completely that the responsibility of it sometimes felt like it could crack me open. Richard resurfaced when Daniel was 9. He called the house on a Sunday evening, friendly as anything, full of explanations that weren't really apologies. He said he'd been going through his own difficulties. He said he wanted to be more present. He took Daniel to a baseball game twice that spring, and Daniel came home from both times quiet in a way that worried me. The way children go quiet when they are working out whether something is safe to feel happy about. Then Richard disappeared again, this time for 3 years. I learned, through the kind of small-town grapevine that moves faster than any newspaper, that Richard Harlow had done very well for himself. He had started a commercial real estate company in Columbus, and the company had grown in ways that seemed faster than honest work usually allows. He was the kind of man who got his name in the business section of the local paper, always photographed at charity events, always standing slightly in front of whoever he was with. He remarried when Daniel was 12, a woman named Sandra from a wealthy family in Cincinnati, and the wedding was apparently quite the occasion. Daniel was not invited. I did not tell Daniel about the things I began to find out about his father in the years that followed. That decision cost me later, and I have made my peace with that. But at the time, I believed I was protecting him. A child does not need to carry the weight of his parents' corruption. A child needs to be allowed to grow up. What I found out slowly, the way you find out most things that powerful people want buried. I had a colleague, a woman named Patricia, who had left teaching to work in the county recorder's office, who mentioned something offhand at a retirement party, a property deal that didn't add up, a rezoning approval that had come through unusually fast. I started paying attention, the way a person who has been wronged pays attention, quietly, carefully, without making a sound. Over the next several years, I collected things. Documents mostly, public records that I requested through formal channels, one form at a time, the way you are allowed to do in this country if you know how to ask. I had a filing cabinet in my home office that I kept locked, and inside it I built a picture, piece by piece, of what Richard Harlow had actually built his business on. Bribery of 2 county officials, a fraudulent environmental assessment on a commercial development that had then flooded the neighboring properties. A business partner pushed out through forged documents and left financially ruined. The man's name was Gerald Sykes, and he had lost his house. I wrote his name on the inside cover of my folder because I felt that someone should remember it. I did not know what I was going to do with any of this. I told myself I was gathering it for Daniel's sake, so that one day, if Daniel needed to know the truth about his father, the truth would be there and documented and real. I told myself it was not about revenge. I told myself that for a long time. Daniel grew up beautifully despite all of it. He was curious and kind and funny, the kind of young man who remembered to ask how you were doing and actually listened to the answer. He graduated 3rd in his class, got a scholarship to Ohio State, called me every Sunday without fail. When he was 25, he met a young woman named Alicia at a conference in Chicago, and the way he talked about her on those Sunday phone calls changed the quality of his voice entirely. Steadier, lighter, like something that had been holding its breath had finally let it go. Alicia was wonderful. I mean that without qualification. She was a civil engineer from a family in western Pennsylvania, practical and warm and exactly the kind of person who could hold her own ground gently. I liked her the first afternoon I met her. I liked the way she looked at my nephew, like he was someone worth the looking. They got engaged in the spring. They planned the wedding for the following June. And it was in the planning of that wedding, about 8 months before it happened, that Daniel called me on a Sunday evening, and there was something careful in his voice that I recognized immediately. He told me that his father had reached out, that Richard wanted to be part of the wedding, that Richard had apparently been in contact with Alicia's family and had made quite an impression. I sat very still on my end of the phone, and I asked Daniel how he felt about it. "I don't know," he said. I think I want to give him a chance. Is that stupid?" "No," I said. "That is not stupid at all. I meant it. A man in his late 20s, about to start a family of his own, wanting to believe his father might have become something better. I was not going to take that from him. I'd never told Daniel what was in my filing cabinet. I still believed, in that moment, that the kindest thing I could do was hold the door open and let him walk through it himself. What I did not know, what Daniel did not tell me until much later, because he was trying to protect me the same way I had been trying to protect him, which is the particular tragedy of people who love each other, was what Richard had told Alicia's family about me. The wedding was held at a hotel ballroom in Columbus on a Saturday in June. 300 guests, white roses and candles, and a string quartet that played something I recognized but couldn't name. I was seated in the second row on the groom's side, behind Richard and Sandra. which I had noticed but said nothing about. I was wearing a navy dress that Carol had always liked on me, and I was trying very hard to feel only the right things. Joy for my nephew, gratitude for the day, warmth for this new family being made. The ceremony was beautiful. Daniel cried when Alicia came down the aisle. I cried too. The vows they had written themselves were specific and honest in the way that only vows written by people who have actually thought about what they are promising can be. I held myself together until they kissed, and then I didn't bother trying. The reception was held in the same ballroom, rearranged during a cocktail hour that I spent talking to Alicia's aunt from Pittsburgh, who turned out to share my enthusiasm for container gardening. I was beginning to feel that the evening would simply be a lovely evening. I was beginning to let down the small, careful guard I had carried in with me. Then the toasts began. Alicia's father went first, gracious and brief. Then the best man, then a college friend of Alicia's who was funny and made the room laugh. Then Richard Harlow stood up with a champagne flute in his hand and a smile that I recognized from 22 years of disliking it. And he began to speak. He talked about Daniel. He talked about how proud he was of the man his son had become. He talked about resilience and character. He used the word legacy twice. He spoke for 4 minutes, which I counted, and during those 4 minutes he built for himself, in front of 300 people, the image of a father who had been present and formative and central to the story of who Daniel was. Then he looked directly at me. He said he wanted to acknowledge the extended family members who had helped out over the years. He said it the way you say something you want people to hear but can't be accused of saying softly, almost gently, with just enough emphasis on helped out to make clear exactly what he meant. A babysitter helping out, a neighbor helping out, someone peripheral and temporary and ultimately replaceable. He smiled at me when he said it. He actually smiled. I felt the room shift. The way a room shifts when everyone suddenly understands that something unkind has just happened and no one quite knows what to do about it. I saw Daniel's face from across the room. That particular stillness that meant he was trying to decide whether to act. I saw Alicia's hand move to his arm. I picked up my folder from under my chair. I want to be precise about this. I did not stand up impulsively. I had kept that folder in my car for 3 months because some part of me, the part that had been paying attention for 22 years, had known that a moment like this might come. I had prayed I wouldn't need it. I had kept it anyway. I stood up. The room was not silent yet, but it went silent very quickly. 300 people, and the only sound was the scrape of my chair, and then nothing. I said, I'd like to say a few words, if I may. My voice was steady. I was surprised by how steady it was. I said that I had raised Daniel from the age of 7. I said that I had been at every school play, every graduation, every Sunday phone call for 18 years. I said that I loved him more than I had words for, and that watching him become the man standing in this room was the greatest privilege of my life. I said all of that looking at my nephew, and when I saw his eyes, I had to take a breath before I could continue. Then I turned to Richard. I said that I had spent many years trying to decide whether the truth was mine to tell. I said I had decided tonight that it was. I opened the folder. I did not read from it. I knew every page by memory. I simply held it because the holding of it was the point. I told the room calmly and specifically what Richard Harlow had built his business on. I named Gerald Sykes. I mentioned the county officials and the fraudulent environmental report. I said that I had copies of every document in the appropriate hands, which was true. I had mailed a full packet to the county prosecutor's office the previous Monday. Richard's face had gone pale before I was halfway through. Sandra had stopped touching his arm. The room was so quiet I could hear the candles. I closed the folder. I looked at Daniel and I said, "You became who you are because of who you are. That belongs to you. No one can take it." Then I sat down. What happened after that is harder to put in a clean order. There was a long moment of silence that felt like falling. Then Alicia's father stood up and started clapping, slowly, and a handful of people joined him, and then more, until it was most of the room. Daniel crossed the floor to me and held me for a long time without saying anything. I held him back. I was shaking slightly, and I was glad that only he could feel it. Richard and Sandra left before the dancing started. I did not watch them go. In the months that followed, the things I had documented were investigated in full. 2 of the officials Richard had bribed agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Gerald Sykes was contacted and has since filed a civil suit. Richard's company is under formal review. I have given interviews to 2 journalists, neither of which I enjoy particularly, but both of which I felt were necessary. Daniel and I had a difficult conversation about 3 weeks after the wedding. He had found out from his cousin on his mother's side that I had known about his father for several years before the wedding. He came to my house on a Sunday. He didn't call first, which told me how hurt he was, and he sat across from me in my kitchen and asked me why I hadn't told him sooner. I did not make excuses. I told him the truth, that I had been trying to protect him, and that in trying to protect him, I had made a decision that was mine to make and had taken from him the ability to make it himself. I told him I was sorry. I told him that the impulse behind it had been love, but that love without honesty is just control with softer edges. And I had lived long enough to know the difference between the two. He sat with that for a while. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something, and the sound of it was so ordinary and so familiar that I felt the whole weight of the years we had shared in that house settle around us. Finally, he said, "You should have told me." "Yes," I said. "I should have. But I understand why you didn't." I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. He turned his hand over and held on. We are not the kind of family that pretends things are resolved when they aren't. The conversation about his father, about what I knew and when I knew it, has continued in smaller pieces over the months since then, the way real conversations do. There are things he is still working out. There are things I am still working out too. That is honest, and honest is what we owe each other. What I know for certain is this: my sister Carol left this world trusting me with the most precious thing she had. I spent 22 years trying to be worthy of that trust, and I will spend whatever years I have left doing the same. I did not raise Daniel to be my child. I raised him to be himself, to be steady and kind and honest enough to sit across from someone who hurt him and tell them the truth about it without cruelty. He learned that last part on his own. I like to think Carol would have appreciated the irony. The folder is still in my filing cabinet. The lock still works. I keep it now, not because I need it, but because Gerald Sykes' name is written on the inside cover, and I made a promise, in a quiet way, to remember it. Some promises you keep for the person you made them to. Some you keep for yourself. Some you keep because the keeping of them is the only way to remain the person you set out to be. All those years ago, on a cold October afternoon, on a concrete step, with a small boy and his backpack and his mother's eyes, "I've got you," I said. I meant it then. I mean it still.